cold morning of the 16th of November, 2018, the quiet streets of Corsicana, Texas, were shattered by the piercing wail of emergency sirens. In a residential neighborhood on South 15th Street, a single-story home was rapidly being consumed by a violent and fast-moving inferno. By the time the Corsicana Fire Department arrived on the scene shortly after 2 a.m., flames were already venting through the roof and windows. The heat was so intense that it threatened neighboring structures, forcing first responders to battle the blaze from a defensive position before they could safely attempt to enter the building. Inside the burning structure was 33-year-old Candace Turner and her children. Candace was a local mother who lived in the home with her 3 kids. And as the smoke billowed into the night sky, neighbors gathered in hushed shock. The scale of the destruction was immediate and total. Once the main body of the fire was suppressed, firefighters transitioned to a search and recovery operation. Inside the charred remains of the house, they discovered the bodies of 3 individuals who had been unable to escape the suffocating smoke and heat. The victims were identified as Candace Turner, her 12-year-old daughter, and her 9-year-old son. All 3 had been trapped inside as the fire spread with unnatural speed through the living quarters. Initially, the community believed they were witnessing a devastating accidental tragedy, perhaps caused by a faulty appliance or an electrical failure. However, as the sun rose over the ruins on South 15th Street, fire marshals and arson investigators began to notice inconsistencies in the debris. The burn patterns and the speed of the fire's progression suggested that this was not a spontaneous accident. One member of the household was noticeably absent from the casualty list. 13-year-old Aries Turner, Candace's eldest son, had been located safely away from the flames. While it is common for survivors of such events to be in a state of profound shock, investigators soon found reason to look more closely at the teenager's actions. The investigation quickly shifted from a standard fire inquiry into a triple homicide probe. Evidence gathered at the scene indicated that the fire had been intentionally set while the family was sleeping, effectively cutting off their avenues of escape. The gravity of the crime sent shockwaves through the city of Corsicana. A 13-year-old boy stood accused of orchestrating a blaze that claimed the lives of his mother and 2 younger siblings. Because of the suspect's age, the legal proceedings that followed were largely shielded from public view, adhering to the confidentiality protocols of the juvenile justice system. The fire marshal's specific findings regarding the accelerants used and the points of origin were eventually sealed by the court. These sealed documents played a critical role in the sentencing phase, where the court had to weigh the extreme nature of the violence against the defendant's status as a minor. This case remains one of the most harrowing events in the history of Navarro County. The investigation focused on the technical evidence of how the fire was started and the subsequent behavior of Aries Turner. It examines the timeline of the November 16th inferno, the immediate response of the Corsicana emergency services, and the forensic discoveries that pointed toward a deliberate act. The tragedy left a permanent mark on the community as they were forced to confront the reality that the Turner family had been destroyed by one of their own. In the quiet early morning hours of the 16th of November, 2018, the residential neighborhood along West 2nd Avenue in Corsicana, Texas, was jolted awake by the shrill wail of sirens. Dispatchers at the local emergency center had received a frantic call reporting a structure fire at a single-family residence. When the first units from the Corsicana Fire Department arrived on the scene shortly after 2:30 a.m., they found the wood frame house at the 1400 block heavily involved in flames. Orange light flickered against the surrounding trees as thick, black smoke billowed into the night sky, creating a visibility barrier that hampered the initial assessment. The heat radiating from the structure was so intense that arriving officers had to position their vehicles at a significant distance to prevent damage to their equipment. Firefighters immediately launched a primary search and rescue operation, though the structural integrity of the home was rapidly deteriorating. Neighbors gathered on the sidewalks, watching as crews battled the blaze with multiple hose lines. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of burning timber and synthetic materials. Reports quickly circulated among the first responders, that a family was likely still trapped inside. Amidst the chaos, authorities located 13-year-old Aries Turner standing outside the burning structure. He was physically unharmed, a stark contrast to the inferno consuming the home behind him. As police secured the perimeter, fire crews pushed into the interior of the house, navigating through a maze of falling debris and zero visibility conditions. The discovery of the victims occurred in stages as the fire was gradually brought under control. Near the rear of the home, firefighters located 33-year-old Candice Turner. Despite the rapid intervention of emergency medical personnel on the scene, it was clear that the intensity of the smoke and heat had left no room for survival. As the search continued into the bedrooms, the grim reality of the night deepened. Crews discovered the bodies of Candice's two younger children, her 12-year-old daughter and her 9-year-old son. The recovery process was slow and methodical, conducted under the watchful eyes of the Navarro County Fire Marshal and local detectives who had already begun to suspect that the origin of the fire was not accidental. The emergency response shifted from a rescue mission to a recovery and forensic operation as the sun began to rise. The charred remains of the Turner family home stood as a skeletal reminder of the night's events. Investigators from the State Fire Marshal's office were called in to assist local authorities in processing the scene. They focused their attention on the points of origin and the patterns of the charring on the walls, looking for signs of accelerants or deliberate tampering with smoke detectors. The clinical precision of the investigation stood in jarring contrast to the emotional weight of the scene, where 3 lives had been extinguished in a matter of minutes. As the bodies were respectfully removed from the premises and transported to the medical examiner's office, the focus turned toward the sole survivor. Aries Turner was taken into custody for questioning while investigators sifted through the ash. The fire marshal's preliminary findings indicated that the fire had been set with calculated intent, specifically targeting the areas where the family was sleeping. The speed at which the fire spread suggested that the perpetrator had a clear understanding of how to maximize the lethality of the blaze. Every charred beam and melted appliance became a piece of a larger puzzle that pointed back to the 13-year-old boy who had watched from the lawn. The documentation of the scene was exhaustive. Investigators utilized thermal imaging and traditional grid mapping to chart the path of the fire. They noted that the exit routes for the victims appeared to have been compromised, leaving Candice Turner and her 2 youngest children with no means of escape. The clinical reports drafted in the aftermath of the discovery detailed the physiological effects of smoke inhalation and thermal trauma, providing a cold, hard look at the final moments of the victims. These documents, combined with the fire marshal's analysis of the accelerants used, formed the foundation of the legal case that would follow. By the time the last embers were extinguished and the yellow crime scene tape was stretched across the property, the Corsicana community was left to grapple with the realization that the tragedy was not a random accident. The emergency response had been swift, and the recovery of the victims had been handled with professional dignity, but the facts remained inescapable. 3 members of the Turner family were dead, and the investigation into the actions of Aries Turner was just beginning. The sealed nature of the findings and the subsequent sentencing would later reflect the gravity of the fire marshal's discoveries on that fatal night, as they uncovered the deliberate steps taken to ensure the house would become a death trap for those inside. The temperature in Corsicana, Texas, had dropped significantly by the late hours of Friday, the 16th of November 2018. On the 200 block of East 13th Avenue, a quiet residential street became the site of an unimaginable catastrophe. When the first emergency calls reached dispatchers just after midnight, they described a structure fire that was already consuming a modest family home. First responders arrived to find the residents fully involved in flames, with orange light reflecting off the surrounding trees and thick smoke masking the stars. Amidst the chaos of hissing hoses and shouting firemen, one figure stood apart from the destruction. 13-year-old Aries Turner was the only member of the household found outside the burning structure. He appeared to be the primary witness to a tragedy beyond comprehension, as the heat from the blaze pushed back the crowds, and the siding of the house curled under the intensity Aries provided his initial account to the officers on the scene. At that moment, he was viewed through a lens of profound sympathy as the sole survivor of a fire that had trapped his entire family within the wooden frame of their home. He told authorities that he had been awoken by the smell of smoke and the sight of growing flames. In those first frantic minutes, his narrative centered on the confusion of the midnight hour and the speed with which the fire had spread through the hallways. Inside the house, the situation was grim. Firefighters pushed through the extreme heat to reach the bedrooms, but the intensity of the inferno made rescue operations nearly impossible. They eventually recovered the bodies of 33-year-old Candace Turner and 2 children, a 12-year-old girl and a 9-year-old boy. The loss of an entire family unit, save for the eldest son, sent a shockwave through the Corsicana community. Neighbors gathered behind yellow police tape, watching as black soot stained the night air, unaware that the fire marshal was already noticing irregularities in the ruins of the Turner home. The initial account provided by Aries Turner began to face the scrutiny of forensic analysis almost immediately. While the 13-year-old described a sudden and accidental outbreak, the physical evidence began to tell a different story. Fire investigators looked for V patterns and pore patterns that indicate where a fire started and how it traveled. In the Turner residence, the fire had not behaved like a standard electrical malfunction or a kitchen accident. It had moved with a ferocity and a specific directionality that suggested the presence of an accelerant. The fire marshal's preliminary findings suggested that the fire originated in multiple locations simultaneously, which is a hallmark of intentional arson. As the sun rose over the smoldering remains the following morning, the investigation transitioned from a tragic accident to a triple homicide inquiry. Aries Turner remained the focus of the interviewers, who sought to reconcile his timeline with the biological and chemical evidence left in the ash. The boy's demeanor during these initial hours became a point of intense focus for the Corsicana Police Department. They noted the specific details he chose to share and those he omitted. His story of a narrow escape seemed increasingly inconsistent with the rapid development of the blaze, which would have likely overcome anyone in the house within seconds had it been an accident. The fire marshal's formal report was comprehensive and ultimately damning. It detailed the use of a flammable liquid that had been distributed in areas designed to block exits and maximize the lethality of the fire. This technical data provided the foundation for the legal proceedings that followed. Because of his age, many of the specific details regarding his motives and the exact contents of his confession remained shielded from the public. However, the weight of the evidence led to his immediate detention. The community struggled to reconcile the image of the young survivor with the reality of the forensic findings. In the months that followed, the legal system in Navarro County handled the case with a degree of privacy mandated by the perpetrator's juvenile status. Yet, the facts of the November night remained clear. 3 lives had been extinguished in a calculated act of violence. Candace Turner and her 2 youngest children had no opportunity to flee the environment that had been intentionally turned into a firebox. The fire marshal's findings, though sealed from general public scrutiny in their entirety, provided the necessary proof to secure a sentence that reflected the gravity of the crime. The narrative of the sole survivor had been a mask, one that fell away as the clinical reality of the arson investigation came to light. The silence that now hangs over the vacant lot on East 13th Avenue serves as a stark reminder of the night Aries Turner stood on the lawn while his family perished inside. The pre-dawn hours of the 16th of November 2018 in Corsicana, Texas, were shattered by the roar of a residential structure fire on South 15th Street. When emergency crews arrived at the Turner household, they were met with a fully involved blaze that appeared to have consumed the structure with unnatural speed. Amidst the chaos of the first responders and the heat of the inferno, 13-year-old Aries Turner stood on the sidewalk, watching the remnants of his home burn. To the initial witnesses and police officers on the scene, he appeared to be a traumatized survivor who had narrowly escaped a nightmare. However, as the sun rose over the charred ruins, The narrative Ares provided to investigators began to fracture under the weight of physical evidence and logical inconsistencies. The first red flag emerged during Ares Turner's initial statement to the Corsicana Police Department. The teenager claimed that he had been jolted awake by the smell of smoke and the sound of crackling flames. He described a frantic, heroic attempt to reach his mother, 33-year-old Candace Turner, and his two younger siblings, a 12-year-old girl and a 9-year-old boy. Ares told officers that the smoke was so thick he could barely breathe, and that the heat was so intense it forced him back, leaving him no choice but to leap from a window to save his own life. While this story initially garnered sympathy, investigators quickly noticed a jarring discrepancy. Ares showed almost no physical signs of having been inside a smoke-filled room. His clothing lacked the heavy scent of soot that typically clings to fire survivors, and he displayed no symptoms of smoke inhalation, such as coughing or watery eyes. His breathing was clear, and his skin was remarkably clean for someone who claimed to have battled through a residential inferno. As the fire marshal began a systematic sweep of the property, the technical findings immediately contradicted the timeline Ares had established. In a typical accidental house fire, there is a clear point of origin and a logical path of progression. In the Turner home, investigators found multiple points of origin, indicating that the fire had been intentionally set in several locations to ensure the building would be engulfed rapidly. The fire marshal discovered traces of a liquid accelerant throughout the hallways, particularly concentrated near the exits of the bedrooms where Candace and the younger children were sleeping. This evidence suggested a deliberate attempt to trap the occupants inside, a finding that turned a tragic accident into a triple homicide investigation. The most damning discrepancy involved the discovery of a gasoline container. Ares Turner had claimed no knowledge of how the fire started, yet the fire marshal located a gas can that had been moved and utilized just before the emergency calls were placed. When investigators pressed Ares on why the fire had spread so much faster than a standard electrical or kitchen fire, his explanations became increasingly erratic. He shifted from being a sleeping victim to someone who had seen shadowy figures, yet he could provide no description of these individuals or explain how they entered the locked home without his knowledge. Neighbors provided the final piece of the early investigative puzzle. Several residents on South 15th Street reported seeing a figure matching Ares's description standing outside the house before the smoke was even visible from the street. One witness noted that the boy did not appear to be panicking or calling for help initially. Instead, he seemed to be waiting. This contradicted his claim that he had just barely escaped the flames. The composure Ares maintained while his mother and sister were being declared deceased at the scene further unsettled veteran investigators. While shock manifests differently in every individual, the clinical detachment Ares displayed, combined with the lack of soot on his person and the fire marshal's discovery of poured gasoline, pointed to a calculated act rather than a tragic accident. These early discrepancies ensured that the investigation shifted focus entirely onto the 13-year-old, leading to the eventual sealing of his legal fate, as the evidence proved he had systematically orchestrated the destruction of his family. The investigation into the fire on North 12th Avenue in Corsicana, Texas, began long before the embers were fully extinguished on the morning of the 16th of November 2018. When the Corsicana Fire Department arrived at the residence of Candace Turner, they encountered a structure heavily involved in flames, with thick, black smoke billowing from the roofline and windows. The intensity of the heat was so severe that it hindered immediate entry into the sleeping quarters. Once the fire was suppressed, the recovery of 33-year-old Candace Turner and two of her children, aged 12 and 9, transformed a local emergency into a high-stakes forensic investigation. The State Fire Marshal's office was called in to lead the scientific scene reconstruction, a process designed to strip away the charred remains of the home, to find the objective truth hidden in the ashes. Fire marshal investigators utilized an outside-in methodology, first examining the exterior of the house to rule out external ignition sources like downed power lines or lightning strikes. They found the exterior utility meters intact, suggesting the fire originated within the four walls of the home. Moving inside, the team faced a scene of total devastation. In arson science, the investigator looks for the lowest point of burning and the most severe charring, as fire naturally travels upward and outward in a V-shaped pattern. In this specific case, the reconstruction revealed something far more calculated. Instead of a single V pattern originating from a faulty appliance or an electrical outlet, investigators identified multiple distinct points of origin throughout the hallway and near the exits of the bedrooms. The physical evidence suggested that the fire did not start by accident. Investigators noted pore patterns on the flooring, which are irregular, charred shapes on the ground that indicate a liquid accelerant was splashed or trailed across the surface. To confirm these visual findings, the fire marshal's team deployed specialized tools and accelerant detection canines. These dogs are trained to alert to the microscopic scent of petroleum products even after they have been scorched by extreme heat. The canine alerted in several locations along the main egress route of the home. Samples of the flooring and subflooring were then collected in airtight containers and sent to a forensic laboratory for gas chromatography and mass spectrometry. The results were definitive. The presence of gasoline was detected in areas where no flammable liquids should have been present. The scientific reconstruction then turned to the thermodynamics of the fire to determine how it moved through the house while the victims were inside. By analyzing the depth of the char on wooden support beams, a process known as chirometry, investigators could estimate the duration and temperature of the fire in specific zones. They determined that the fire reached a state of flashover where every combustible surface in a room ignites simultaneously within minutes. This rapid progression was not consistent with a slow-burning accidental fire. It was the direct result of a liquid accelerant being used to boost the fire's growth. The fire marshal concluded that the accelerant had been placed in a manner that effectively created a wall of fire between the bedrooms and the only viable exits, trapping Candace Turner and her two youngest children inside. A critical component of the fire marshal's findings involved the analysis of the smoke and soot patterns, known as ghosting. These patterns showed that the bedroom doors were open or partially open when the fire began, allowing the toxic smoke to fill the rooms almost instantly. Forensic pathology reports corroborated the fire marshal's timeline, showing that the victims had high levels of carbon monoxide in their systems, proving they were alive and breathing when the fire was set. This detail was vital for the reconstruction, as it established that the fire was the primary cause of death and not an attempt to cover up a prior crime. As the physical evidence mounted, the focus shifted to the only survivor of the fire who had been present when it started. 13-year-old Aries Turner. The fire marshal's technical report was compared against the initial statements provided by the teenager. Aries had claimed he woke up to the smell of smoke and escaped, but the scientific reconstruction told a different story. The patterns of the fire suggested it had been set from a position that allowed the person to exit the front door easily, while the rest of the house became a chimney. There were no signs of a struggle or an intruder. The ignition source was determined to be a handheld open flame, such as a lighter, applied directly to the gasoline-soaked carpet and furniture. The fire marshal's final report was a clinical, step-by-step breakdown of a deliberate act. It documented how the accelerant was poured in a continuous trail, leading from the living area toward the bedrooms, ensuring that the fire would cut off any hope of escape. The precision of the pour patterns indicated a level of intent that outweighed the typical curiosity seen in juvenile fire-setting cases. This was a targeted application of fire science used as a weapon. The technical findings were so comprehensive that they became the cornerstone of the prosecution's case against Aries Turner. Because of the age of the perpetrator and the severity of the crime, a triple homicide of his own family members, the legal proceedings were complex. The fire marshal's findings remained a sealed part of the record during much of the juvenile adjudication process. However, the physical evidence of the gasoline-soaked floors and the calculated placement of the fire points made the defense's task nearly impossible. The science did not lie. It showed a house turned into a trap by one of its own occupants. In the final phase of the investigation, The fire marshal's office produced a 3D digital reconstruction of the fire's growth. This model demonstrated that from the moment of ignition, the family had less than 2 minutes to react before the hallway became impassable. This reconstruction proved that the victims never had a chance to save themselves. The weight of this scientific testimony, combined with the chemical evidence of gasoline, led to the conclusion of the legal process. Aries Turner was eventually sentenced to 40 years in prison for the deaths of his mother, sister, and brother. The case remains a harrowing example of how fire investigators can use the physics of heat and the chemistry of accelerants to speak for those who can no longer speak for themselves, ensuring that the narrative of the fire is told through the evidence left behind in the ruins. In the pre-dawn stillness of the 16th of November 2018, the quiet atmosphere of North 13th Street in Corsicana, Texas, was shattered by the roar of an accelerating structure fire. When first responders arrived at the Turner residence shortly after 4 a.m., they were met with a scene of absolute devastation. Flames were already venting through the roof, casting a sickly orange glow over the neighborhood. At the center of this inferno were 33-year-old Candace Turner and 2 of her children, a 12-year-old girl and a 9-year-old boy. They had narrowly escaped a death trap that, according to investigators, appeared designed to ensure no one made it out alive. As the smoke cleared and the structural embers were cooled, the focus of the investigation shifted from rescue to the grim, methodical science of fire forensics. State fire marshals and local investigators began their sweep of the skeletal remains of the home. Their primary objective was to determine the cause and origin of the blaze. In a typical accidental fire, investigators search for a single point of failure, such as a frayed wire, a malfunctioning space heater, or an unattended cooking appliance. However, the evidence in the Turner home immediately pointed toward a much more calculated and sinister reality. Investigators identified multiple, disconnected points of origin throughout the house. This is a primary forensic red flag for arson. Accidental fires rarely start in 3 different rooms simultaneously. Each point of origin represented a separate ignition event, suggesting that the perpetrator had moved through the house with a specific purpose. The smell of petroleum was unmistakable to the investigators as they sifted through the charred timber and melted remains of the family's belongings. Forensic analysts utilized hydrocarbon detectors to confirm the presence of an accelerant. They discovered what are known in the field as pore patterns on the flooring. These are distinct, irregular shapes where a liquid fuel has been splashed or trailed across a surface, burning deeper into the subfloor than the surrounding materials. The patterns indicated that a flammable substance had been deliberately trailed through the main egress routes of the home. This was not a fire that had started by chance or neglect. It was a fire that had been fed and directed. Perhaps the most chilling discovery made by the fire marshal concerned the strategic location of these origin points. One fire had been set near the kitchen area, but others were concentrated in the hallways, leading directly to the bedrooms where Candace and her younger children had been sleeping. By igniting the hallway, the perpetrator had effectively cut off the primary escape route for the occupants. This strategic placement served as powerful, clinical evidence of premeditated intent. The goal was not merely to destroy property or cause a distraction. The evidence suggested a desire to ensure the occupants remained trapped within the burning structure. The fire was positioned to act as a physical barrier between the victims and their only way out. At the center of the investigation stood 13-year-old Aries Turner. While his mother and siblings were fighting for their lives through the thick, toxic smoke and searing heat, Aries was found outside the home, physically unharmed and away from the immediate danger. The contrast between his condition and the harrowing, life-threatening escape of his family raised immediate questions for the Corsicana Police Department. As the fire marshal's findings were compiled, the narrative of a tragic accident fell away. It was replaced by a clinical documentation of a deliberate attempt at mass casualty within a single family unit. To understand the intensity of the fire, investigators examined the V patterns on the walls. In fire science, heat and flames travel upward and outward, leaving a V-shaped char mark that points back to the source of the ignition. In the Turner residence, the angles of the V-patterns were unusually wide and numerous, suggesting a rapid, high-temperature combustion, fueled by something other than standard household materials. The fire had moved with a velocity that exceeded what is typically seen in a residential blaze. This rapid spread was attributed directly to the liquid accelerant found at the primary origin points. Every piece of charred debris analyzed in the laboratory further solidified the forensic case against the teenager. Investigators also looked for signs of spalling on the concrete and the depth of char on the wooden supports. Spalling occurs when extreme heat causes the moisture within concrete to expand rapidly, popping off the surface layer. The presence of spalling in specific areas of the hallway indicated that the fire had reached intense temperatures almost immediately after ignition, a characteristic of accelerant-fueled fires. The depth of the charring on the door frames leading to the bedrooms showed that the fire had been burning hottest at the floor level, right where the pore patterns were identified. This confirmed that the fire had been set low to ensure that the smoke and heat would rise quickly to fill the rooms where the family slept. These forensic findings were not merely technical observations. They became the bedrock of the prosecution's legal case. Because the fire was set in a manner that specifically targeted sleeping victims and blocked their only means of exit, the charges leveled against Aries Turner were elevated to 3 counts of attempted capital murder, along with arson. The fire marshal's report, which remained a cornerstone of the legal proceedings, detailed a level of calculation that was deeply disturbing for an individual of his age. The evidence suggested a clear, functional understanding of how fire behaves and a specific intent to use that knowledge as a weapon against his own mother and siblings. The investigation concluded that the fire at the Turner home was an act of extreme, premeditated violence. The physical evidence, the multiple origin points, the chemical residue of accelerants, and the strategic placement of the blazes painted a picture of a 13-year-old who had methodically planned the destruction of his family. While Candace Turner and her 2 younger children survived the physical flames, the fire marshal's findings ensured that the legal system would recognize the true nature of the events that transpired that November morning in Corsicana. The clinical reality of the charcoal and chemical traces provided the final, undeniable proof of a boy's intent to end the lives of those closest to him while they were at their most vulnerable. The investigation into the fire that claimed the lives of 33-year-old Candace Turner and 2 of her children began in the early morning hours of the 16th of November 2018, while the ruins of their duplex on North 13th Street in Corsicana, Texas, were still smoldering. Law enforcement officials and fire marshals initially approached 13-year-old Aries Turner as a grieving survivor. He was the only member of the household to make it out of the structure alive, and the initial phase of the investigation focused on providing him support while gathering any information he might have regarding the cause of the blaze. Detectives conducted their first series of interviews with the boy in a setting designed to be non-threatening, assuming he was a witness to a tragic accident or perhaps a victim of an outside intruder. During these initial conversations, Aries provided a narrative of the night that suggested the fire had started and spread rapidly while the family was asleep. He described waking up to a house filled with smoke and heat, eventually finding a way to escape the inferno that trapped his mother, his 12-year-old sister, and his 9-year-old brother inside. However, even as he spoke, investigators from the Texas State Fire Marshal's office were conducting a forensic sweep of the property. Their findings quickly began to contradict the timeline and details provided by the teenager. The fire patterns within the duplex did not suggest an electrical failure or a localized accidental ignition. Instead, investigators discovered multiple points of origin and the distinct chemical signature of an accelerant. The shift from treating Aries as a survivor to viewing him as a suspect occurred as the physical evidence became impossible to ignore. Fire marshals determined that rubbing alcohol had been poured in specific areas of the home, including near the bedrooms where the victims were located, to ensure the fire would spread with lethal speed. When detectives brought Aries back for subsequent interviews, the tone of the questioning changed. They began to highlight the discrepancies between the forensic data and his previous statements. Investigators noted that Aries lacked the physical signs of having attempted a rescue. There were no significant burns or soot patterns on his clothing or skin that would align with a person trying to navigate a flashover fire to save family members. Faced with the evidence recovered from the scene, Aries' story began to undergo several revisions. Under the pressure of persistent questioning by Corsicana police and arson investigators, the 13-year-old eventually abandoned his initial account of the night. He admitted to intentionally setting the fire that killed his mother and 2 siblings. During the confession, he detailed how he used rubbing alcohol as an accelerant, pouring it out and igniting it while the others were asleep. The clinical nature of his admission stood in stark contrast to the horrific consequences of the act. He provided investigators with a motive rooted in a dispute with his mother, reportedly involving anger over a video game and disciplinary measures she had implemented. The interview process revealed a disturbing level of premeditation. Aries described the steps he took to ensure the fire would grow large enough to prevent escape. This admission transformed the case from a tragic house fire into a triple homicide investigation. Because the suspect was only 13 years old, the legal proceedings that followed were largely shielded from public view, but the gravity of the crime meant that the standard juvenile justice protocols were significantly adjusted. The interviews conducted by law enforcement served as the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, as they contained the direct admission of guilt that matched the chemical and thermal evidence found by the fire marshals. Throughout the interrogation, detectives were tasked with balancing the legal rights of a minor with the necessity of extracting the truth regarding 3 deaths. The transition from a sympathetic interview of a victim to a high-stakes interrogation of a perpetrator was described by those involved as a somber realization of the youth's culpability. Once the confession was secured, the focus moved toward the legal determination of how a child of that age should be sentenced for such an extreme act of violence. The fire marshal's report, which documented the calculated nature of the accelerant use, supported the theory that the act was not a spontaneous mistake, but a deliberate attempt to cause fatal harm. In the judicial phase, Judge James Lagomarsino presided over the proceedings. The interviews and the forensic evidence led to a determinate sentence, a specific legal structure in Texas that allows a juvenile to start their sentence in a youth facility and potentially transition to an adult prison to finish the term. Aries Turner was sentenced to 40 years in the custody of the Texas Juvenile Justice Department. This maximum sentence for a juvenile in such circumstances reflected the severity of the loss of life and the calculated method of the crime. The records surrounding the specific psychological evaluations conducted after the interviews remained sealed, but the public facts of the case painted a picture of a domestic dispute that escalated into a mass casualty event. The case concluded with the recognition that the physical evidence provided by the fire marshal's office was the only reason the truth surfaced. Had investigators relied solely on the initial account provided by the survivor, the intentional nature of the fire might have remained hidden. The shift in the interviews, moving methodically from a place of empathy to a rigorous examination of the facts, allowed the Corsicana Police Department to hold the 13-year-old accountable for the deaths of Candace Turner and her 2 younger children. The duplex on North 13th Street was eventually cleared, leaving behind a community shaken by the revelation that the sole survivor of the tragedy was also its architect. The sealed nature of the final sentencing and the juvenile records ensured that while the facts of the crime were public, the long-term management of Aries Turner would remain under the strict oversight of the state's correctional and rehabilitative systems. In the early morning hours of the 16th of November 2018, the quiet of Corsicana, Texas, was shattered by a residential fire that would become one of the most harrowing cases in the region's history. Firefighters arriving at the scene on the 1100 block of North Beaton Street encountered a wood frame structure fully engulfed in flames. Inside the home were 33-year-old Candace Turner and 2 of her children, a 12-year-old daughter and a 9-year-old son. Despite the desperate efforts of first responders to suppress the blaze and reach those trapped inside, the fire proved fatal for all three. The intensity of the heat and the speed with which the fire consumed the residence immediately drew the scrutiny of the State Fire Marshal's office, as the circumstances did not align with a standard accidental electrical or kitchen fire. As investigators sifted through the charred remains of the Turner household, the initial theory of a tragic accident quickly evaporated. Forensic evidence indicated that the fire had been intentionally set, with investigators finding clear signs that accelerants were used to ensure the flames spread rapidly through the occupied home while the family slept. The focus of the investigation turned inward toward the sole surviving member of the immediate household, 13-year-old Aries Turner. Within 24 hours of the tragedy, local authorities took the teenager into custody. He was initially held on charges of arson, but as the medical examiner's reports confirmed the causes of death for his mother and siblings, the gravity of the legal situation escalated. The decision to charge Aries Turner with capital murder presented a complex legal landscape for the Navarro County District Attorney's Office. In the state of Texas, capital murder is defined as an intentional killing under specific aggravating circumstances, such as murdering more than one person during the same criminal transaction, or committing murder during the commission of arson. Because Aries was only 13 years old at the time of the offense, the justice system faced a rigid framework regarding how to proceed with a juvenile offender. Unlike older teenagers who might be certified to stand trial as adults, Texas law at the time placed strict age limitations on such certifications for certain violent crimes, specifically preventing children under 14 from being tried in the adult system for capital offenses. Under the Texas Family Code, the prosecution of a 13-year-old for capital murder remains within the jurisdiction of the juvenile court system. However, the severity of the allegations against Aries Turner meant that even within the juvenile system, the stakes were incredibly high. Prosecutors sought what is known as a determinate sentence. This is a unique legal mechanism in Texas that allows for a juvenile to be sentenced to a lengthy term that begins in a juvenile facility and can be transferred to an adult prison once the offender reaches adulthood. This pathway ensures that the state can impose a significant punishment for heinous crimes, while technically adhering to the rehabilitative focus of the juvenile justice framework. The fire marshal's findings were instrumental in establishing the premeditated nature of the act during the proceedings. The evidence showed that the fire originated in multiple locations and was designed to block the primary exits, making escape nearly impossible for Candace Turner and her children. During the legal process, much of the specific testimony regarding the fire's origin and the teenager's recorded statements was shielded from the public eye to protect the privacy inherent in juvenile law. These sealed findings provided the necessary evidence to prove that the fire was not a result of juvenile curiosity or play, but a calculated act with lethal intent. Aries Turner was eventually adjudicated for the capital murder of his mother and two siblings. The judge, weighing the fire marshal's detailed report and the impact on the surviving extended family, handed down a 40-year determinate sentence. This sentence reflected the maximum allowed under the specific legal guidelines for an offender of his age. The ruling mandated that he remain in the custody of the Texas Juvenile Justice Department until his 19th birthday. At that milestone, a court would be required to hold a hearing to determine if his conduct and progress warranted a transfer to the Texas Department of Criminal Justice to serve the remainder of the 4-decade term in an adult facility. The case of Aries Turner remains a grim example of the intersections between juvenile law and extreme violence. The legal framework used to prosecute him was designed to handle the most severe infractions while acknowledging the developmental status of a 13-year-old. For the community of Corsicana, the resolution of the legal case provided a definitive end to the investigative process. Yet the loss of Candace Turner and her 2 children left a lasting impact on the neighborhood. The fire marshal's findings served as the clinical foundation for a sentence that ensured the perpetrator would remain under state supervision well into his adult years, balancing the limitations of juvenile law with the demand for justice. The quiet of the early morning hours on the 16th of November 2018 in Corsicana, Texas, was shattered by the roar of a fast-moving structure fire on the 700 block of North Beaton Street. When emergency responders arrived, they found a wood frame house engulfed in flames so intense that entry was initially impossible. As the heat subsided and the smoke began to clear, the grim reality of the scene emerged. Inside the charred remains of the home, investigators discovered the bodies of 33-year-old Candace Turner, her 12-year-old daughter, and her 9-year-old son. The only member of the household to escape the blaze was the eldest child, 13-year-old Aries Turner. While the community initially grieved for a boy who had lost his entire family, the subsequent investigation by the State Fire Marshal's office would transform the narrative from a tragic accident into a calculated triple homicide. The prosecution's case against Aries Turner relied heavily on the technical expertise and physical findings of the fire marshal. Arson investigation is a clinical process of elimination. And in this instance, the physical evidence spoke louder than any witness testimony. Investigators began by meticulously combing through the debris to identify the fire's point of origin. In a typical accidental house fire, there is usually one clear starting point, such as a faulty electrical outlet, a grease fire in the kitchen, or a discarded cigarette. However, the marshal's report revealed a much more disturbing pattern. They identified multiple points of origin throughout the house, a finding that almost always indicates human intervention. By analyzing the burn patterns on the walls and floors, known as char patterns and V patterns, the investigators could see that the fire had been deliberately set in different locations to ensure the structure would be fully consumed as quickly as possible. Beyond the multiple points of origin, the fire marshal's chemical analysis provided the prosecution with the definitive evidence needed to prove intent. Samples of the flooring and debris were sent to a forensic laboratory, where tests confirmed the presence of liquid accelerants. The prosecution argued that these flammable liquids had been poured in strategic areas to create a wall of fire that would prevent those inside from escaping. This finding was crucial because it directly contradicted the idea of a spontaneous or accidental ignition. The presence of an accelerant suggested a level of preparation and premeditation that went far beyond a childhood mistake or an impulsive act of curiosity. For the prosecution, the fire marshal's report was the cornerstone of their argument that Aries Turner had systematically planned the destruction of his home and the deaths of his mother and siblings. During the legal proceedings, the prosecution utilized the fire marshal's findings to reconstruct a timeline of the morning's events. They pointed to the speed at which the fire spread as proof that the act was designed to be lethal. A natural fire takes time to grow, often providing occupants with a window of opportunity to wake up and flee. The fire marshal's testimony established that because of the accelerants used, the fire would have reached a flashover state in a matter of minutes, trapping Candace Turner and her younger children in their beds before they could even realize the danger. The prosecution emphasized that while Aries was safely outside, his family had no chance of survival due to the volatility of the fire he had ignited. This technical data served to illustrate the cold and calculated nature of the crime to the court. The prosecution also used the fire marshal's analysis of the home's exits to further demonstrate intent. Investigators found that the fire had been concentrated near the primary points of egress. By setting fires near the doors, the perpetrator had essentially sealed the victims inside a burning tomb. The prosecution argued that a 13-year-old would understand the basic mechanics of how a fire prevents movement, and the marshal's findings supported the theory that the placement of the fire was a deliberate tactical choice. This evidence was used to counter any defense claims that the boy did not understand the gravity of his actions or that he had not intended for his family to perish. The physical state of the house provided a silent but undeniable testimony to the lethal intent behind the arson. Linking these scientific findings to Aries Turner himself involved a combination of physical evidence and the boy's own inconsistent statements. When questioned, Aries provided accounts of the fire that were physically impossible according to the fire marshal's reconstruction. He claimed to have attempted to help his family, but the marshal noted that the heat signatures and the location of the fire would have made such attempts impossible without the boy sustaining significant injuries himself. The lack of soot in his airways and the absence of thermal burns on his clothing suggested he was already at a safe distance when the fire reached its peak. The prosecution argued that his survival was not a miracle of timing, but the result of being the one who struck the match and then stepped away to watch the results. The weight of the fire marshal's sealed findings proved insurmountable for the defense. In the juvenile justice system, the prosecution must meet a high burden of proof to show that a minor committed an act that would be considered a capital offense if committed by an adult. The detailed reports regarding the use of fuels, the multiple ignition sites, and the compromised exits provided a clear map of a premeditated homicide. The technical data stripped away the emotional complexity of the case and focused the court's attention on the physical reality of what had occurred inside the Turner home. It was no longer a matter of a child playing with fire. It was a matter of a child using fire as a weapon of mass destruction against his own kin. Ultimately, the fire marshal's findings led to a conviction that carried the maximum possible penalty for a juvenile in the state of Texas. Aries Turner was sentenced to 40 years in the custody of the Texas Juvenile Justice Department, with the possibility of being transferred to an adult prison to finish his term. The prosecution successfully argued that the severity of the findings warranted the harshest sentence allowed by law. The sealed nature of many of these findings during the initial stages of the case only added to the gravity of the final revelation. In the end, it was the clinical scientific analysis of the charred remains of the Turner home that ensured Aries Turner would be held accountable for the deaths of Candace Turner and her 2 young children, providing a definitive answer to the horrific events of that November morning. On the morning of the 16th of November 2018, the quiet community of Corsicana, Texas, was disrupted by a catastrophic house fire on Southeast 10th Street. When emergency responders arrived at the scene around 4 a.m., they discovered a residence fully engulfed in flames with several occupants still inside. In the aftermath of the blaze, 33-year-old Candace Turner was found dead. Her 12-year-old daughter and 9-year-old son survived the inferno, but suffered significant injuries and psychological trauma. The investigation into the cause of the fire quickly shifted from a potential accident to a criminal inquiry when evidence suggested the fire had been deliberately set. The individual identified as the perpetrator was Candace's own son, 13-year-old Aries Turner. The legal proceedings that followed focused heavily on the psychological state of the young teenager. Forensic psychologists were tasked with deconstructing the mindset of a child who would choose to set fire to his home while his mother and siblings slept. These evaluations sought to determine if Aries Turner suffered from a specific mental health disorder, or if his actions were the result of environmental stressors and perceived emotional grievances. During clinical interviews, experts noted a profound sense of detachment in the boy's demeanor. He did not exhibit the typical emotional responses expected of a child who had just lost his mother and nearly killed his siblings. Instead, the evaluations revealed a youth who felt a deep-seated sense of isolation within his own family unit. A central theme in the psychological profile of Aries Turner was his perceived lack of affection. He expressed to evaluators that he felt unloved and neglected by his mother, believing that his younger siblings were favored over him. This perception of being an outcast in his own home fueled a simmering resentment that eventually manifested in extreme violence. Psychologists pointed out that while many teenagers experience feelings of being misunderstood, Aries lacked the coping mechanisms to process these emotions healthily. His motive was not financial or rooted in a desire for freedom. It was a lethal expression of emotional pain and a calculated attempt to erase the source of his perceived unhappiness. The fire marshal's findings played a critical role in corroborating the psychological evidence of premeditation. Investigators determined that the fire was not a spontaneous act of anger, but a planned event. Accelerants were used in strategic locations to ensure the fire spread rapidly and effectively. This level of planning indicated a high degree of cognitive function and executive control, which complicated the defense's efforts to portray the act as a mere impulsive lapse in judgment. The fire marshal's report suggested that Ares had specifically waited until the house was quiet and his family was in a deep sleep, maximizing the lethality of the blaze. This evidence of cold calculation was a primary factor in the court's assessment of his dangerousness to the community. As the case moved through the Navarro County judicial system, the tension between Ares's chronological age and the severity of his crime remained a point of contention. The psychological evaluations suggested that his risk of reoffending was high without intensive, long-term intervention. Experts argued that the lack of remorse shown in the immediate aftermath of the fire was a concerning indicator of his personality development. They noted that his focus remained primarily on his own feelings of being slighted, rather than the devastating loss of his mother's life, or the pain inflicted on his brother and sister. This narcissistic focus is often a red flag in juvenile forensic assessments, indicating a trajectory toward more serious, antisocial behavior. The potential motives explored during the trial highlighted a breakdown in the family dynamic that was invisible to those outside the home. Neighbors and acquaintances had seen a seemingly normal family, unaware of the volatile emotions brewing within the 13-year-old. The psychological reports delved into the history of the household, looking for signs of abuse or previous behavioral issues that might explain such a radical escalation. While some history of behavioral instability was noted, nothing in his past fully prepared the community for the events of November 16. The transition from a troubled youth to a perpetrator of matricide and arson was a focal point for the experts trying to map out his psychological descent. Ultimately, the findings of the fire marshal and the results of the psychological evaluations were sealed to protect the privacy of the surviving minors and the sensitive nature of the juvenile court proceedings. However, these documents formed the backbone of the sentencing phase. The judge had to weigh the possibility of rehabilitation for a 13-year-old against the necessity of protecting the public from an individual capable of such calculated destruction. The motives of Ares Turner, rooted in a lethal combination of perceived neglect and a lack of empathy, remained the defining narrative of the case. The tragedy in Corsicana serves as a clinical example of how internal emotional fractures, when left unaddressed, can lead to an irreversible and deadly conclusion within the family structure. The investigation into the 2018 fire on North Beaton Street in Corsicana reached a critical turning point when the State Fire Marshal's office completed its forensic analysis. Investigators concluded the blaze was not an accident, but a deliberate act of arson. Because the suspect, Ares Turner, was only 13 years old at the time of the incident, the legal proceedings that followed were shrouded in the strict confidentiality of the Texas juvenile justice system. This secrecy was intended to protect the rights of the minor, yet it left the community and the grieving family of Candace Turner searching for clarity regarding the tragedy that claimed 3 lives. During the court proceedings, the specific details of the fire marshal's report remained behind closed doors. Prosecutors presented evidence suggesting that Ares Turner intentionally set the home ablaze, while his stepmother, 33-year-old Candace Turner, and her 2 young children were inside. The legal battle focused on the severity of the act versus the age of the perpetrator. Ultimately, the court determined that the case would be handled within the juvenile system, ensuring that any sentence served would be overseen by the Texas Juvenile Justice Department rather than an immediate adult prison facility. The final determination in the case of Ares Turner resulted in a determinate sentence. This specific legal mechanism allowed the court to sentence the 13-year-old to a term of 40 years. Under this arrangement, Turner was committed to a state juvenile facility with the provision for a potential transfer to the adult prison system once he reached the age of 18. This sentence was the maximum allowable under the juvenile statutes for the charges brought against him. The court mandated that a subsequent hearing would occur as he approached adulthood to decide if he had been rehabilitated or if the remainder of his sentence should be served in an adult penitentiary. While the specifics of the testimony and the psychiatric evaluations remain sealed by court order, the outcome provided a definitive end to the criminal investigation. For the residents of Corsicana, the resolution of the case brought a somber closure to one of the most devastating incidents in the city's history. The sealed findings and the final court orders ensure that while the public may never know the full details of the motives, the legal system has rendered its final judgment on the events of the 16th of November 2018. The quiet streets of Corsicana, Texas, remained heavy with the scent of smoke long after the embers at the Turner residence were extinguished. On the 16th of November 2018, the community lost 33-year-old Candace Turner and two of her children, aged 12 and 9, in a blaze that investigators determined was no accident. The revelation that the fire had been intentionally set by Candace's own 13-year-old son, Aries Turner, transformed a local tragedy into a source of profound communal shock. Neighbors who once saw the Turner children playing in the yard were forced to reckon with the reality that such extreme violence could originate from within the family unit itself. In the months following the fire marshal's findings provided the technical evidence needed to confirm the origin and intent of the blaze. Because of Aries Turner's age at the time of the offense, the legal proceedings were handled within the juvenile justice system, resulting in a sentence that remains sealed from the public eye. This legal confidentiality is a standard practice for minors, yet it left many in the region seeking a sense of closure that the court records could not provide. For the people of Corsicana, the focus eventually shifted from the courtroom back to the lives of the three victims who were lost that night. Teachers and friends remember Candace as a mother whose life was tragically cut short alongside her two youngest children. Their absence created a void in local schools and neighborhoods that persists years later. The legacy of the Turner family in Corsicana is now a somber duality. It serves as a reminder of the fragility of life and the devastating impact of juvenile arson. As the community continues to move forward, the memory of Candace and her two children remains a poignant testament to the lives they lived before the fire.